Hey guys, this is Holland Chambers Biology. I'm bringing to you a lecture about microevolution versus macroevolution. So what we're going to talk about today is how things can change tiny within their own population versus taking an original species and changing it into something completely different. So what we're going to be dealing with is this commonality of this change over time. So micro, again, is going to be observable. It's going to be looking at things that we can actually see for ourselves, like antibiotic resistant bacteria. We see that changing year after year until it eventually becomes an entirely new species. And so in order to distinguish if it's going to be a new species, we do have to do DNA analysis to verify that that species is no longer viable to mate with the original species. And so if they're no longer mating, that means that their children most likely are not able to be viable. Macroevolution is the evolution of, reptiles into birds, how dinosaurs suddenly became chickens, right? How did that happen? So something totally different. Now, let's go ahead and start with micro. So microevolution are these small changes that you can see over a period of generation after generation. And so this is usually caused by natural selection, sexual selection. So the female preference has started to change. Maybe there was some type of migration that was happening where you're actually flowing the genes back and forth of that population. And we just start seeing these little changes. So maybe it's a slight variation in wing color, or like with these blue-footed boobies, their toes are just slightly different. They're still the bird, still a blue-footed booby, everything else is still exactly the same, but it's just their feet are slightly changed. So these tiny changes are what helps us to lead into eventually an entirely new species. So given time and of course selection. Now speciation is when you have a species that has been generally separated over time. So they've been isolated. For example, the squirrels in the Grand Canyon, they obviously aren't going to jump over the Grand Canyon to mate, and so therefore their allele frequencies has stayed separate. They've mated with only those squirrels on each side, and eventually over thousands of years those squirrels have become completely different species. And so we are going to talk a little bit in another lecture about the different types of isolation. So whether they are temporal, which is timing, so if the species are no longer mating at the same time or season. Also behavioral is a mating ritual, so maybe like their dance or song isn't as attractive anymore. And then of course geographical is an actual barrier, so whether it's a river, a valley, an island, things like that will actually isolate those species to no longer mate. And so once you get speciation, we start to get what we call adaptive radiation. So adaptive radiation is where we're going to start with one original ancestor and then literally radiate out into many different ancestors that are each unique for their own niche or job. And so these are the Galapagos finches here. You can see that many of these finches have isolated into eating only insects. Some actually eat fruits, others eat cactus, some eat seeds. And eventually this radiation from an original ancestor allows us to increase genetic diversity and of course increase diversity of the planet. So we have a lot more variety of this particular organism, even though these organisms are no longer mating together. Okay, now macro in Latin means large. So we're talking about taking, a little tiny organism and suddenly becoming a huge dragon. So how the heck did that happen? Taking a dog and suddenly becoming a whale. And so these are extremely large variations. This you cannot see. So it happens over millions of years. The only way that we can tell if something has gone through macroevolution is based off of fossil records. And so fossils are very misleading because a lot of times we don't necessarily have the DNA, and it can be extremely controversial because my thoughts about what these bones are showing us versus your thoughts on what these bones are showing us can actually be two different things. And so that means that a lot of times in evolution, there's a lot of arguments as far as, who's right and who's wrong. But regardless, the agents of change. So I do need for you guys to know what these are. So there's our 5 agents of change that help to drive whether or not we as a species are going to change or if we're going to stay the same. Now keep in mind, if we do stay the same, that's what's known as no evolution or Hardy-Weinberg's principles. And so the agents that drive change is number 1, mutation. So that's the number 1 quickest way to evolve. Number 2 is gene flow, which again is the migration of a species. If you are non-randomly mating, that means that you are specifically picking a mate, which is sexual selection. That's going to alter the traits of our species. Genetic drift, again, is a per chance event. So a hurricane or tsunami or something just happens to lift you up and stick you over on the other side of the mountain range. You can't help that. And suddenly you're only mating with those species and we start to change, And so that's because our genetics is now different from the original population. And then, of course, you also have natural selection. So if the environment changes, then we're going to have to adapt. So whether that is behavioral or physical or functional, something's got to change. So keep in mind that with evolution, what we're talking about here, good old Pokemon, is the changing of an organism. So starting from a fish and it ended up as a water dragon. And so how do we go about doing that? Well, again, it's through our agents of change, and it's also through this process of going from small to very large. So microevolution to macroevolution. So hopefully that helps you guys out. Again, this is Holland Chambers Biology bringing to you micro versus macroevolution. Let me know if you have any questions. So email me at SchoolLoop or DM me on Instagram. Thanks for listening.